My grandmother, Clara Mullen, died in her sleep on the last Sunday of September, 1964. She was 99 years old, and she had lived in the same stone house on Linden Street in Scranton, Pennsylvania, for 71 of those years. When my mother sent me up to the attic to begin sorting what the family would keep and what would go to the church rummage sale, I expected the ordinary contents of an old attic. Broken chairs, tin boxes of Christmas cards, a wedding dress wrapped in brown paper, a yellowed newspaper from the day President Kennedy had been shot in Dallas. What I did not expect was the biscuit tin. It sat on a cedar chest in the far corner of the attic, in the place where my grandmother used to sit in her younger years, with her knitting basket by the small circular window. The tin was square and tarnished, the kind of English tin that had once held shortbread biscuits sent from Liverpool. And when I lifted it, something inside shifted with the soft, dry sound of paper rubbing against paper. I wiped the dust from the lid. I carried it over to the window, where the light was better. I opened it. Every envelope had been addressed to Mrs. Clara Mullen, 113 Linden Street, Scranton, Pennsylvania, in the same tight, sloping hand. None of them had a return address on the outside, except for the one sitting on the top of the stack. That one had come from Denver, Colorado, in December of 1893. I sat down on the cedar chest, and I took the envelopes out one by one, and I laid them in a line along the attic floor. And on top of the newest letter, I found a single folded sheet of lined paper, written many years later, in a handwriting I knew better than my own. It said this: "He came home. That is the only story that matters. But the story before that, the story I never told, I would like someone to know it when I am gone. So I will leave these here. Read them if you can, and if you cannot, burn them in the kitchen stove, as I was told to do with the first. Clara Mullen, May, 1962. That night, I went downstairs, and I told my mother I would not be helping with the rummage sale after all. I took a week's leave from the newspaper in Pittsburgh, where I work as a copy editor. I brought my grandmother's biscuit tin to the kitchen table of the stone house on Linden Street, and I read the letters from the bottom of the stack up to the top. This is what they told me. In February of 1891, my grandmother was 26 years old. She had been married 4 years to a young carpenter named Thomas Mullen, and they lived in a small rented house at the end of Linden Street, 3 doors down from the stone house where she would later live out the rest of her days. They had 1 child, my uncle Michael, who was 18 months old at that time and already walking, already pointing at his father's hat every morning and saying the word "da" in the serious voice that small children use when they are still new to speech. Thomas Mullen was 28 years old. He had black hair and the long, careful hands of a carpenter. In the framed photograph that hung above my grandmother's bed until the end of her life, he stands in front of the Mullen colliery in a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows and a timber saw balanced across his shoulder. He had not been born to the mines. His father had come out of County Cork in 1860 and had worked above ground his whole life. First as a teamster, then as a stable master for the Delaware and Lackawanna Railroad. Thomas was the first Mullen ever to go underground, and he did not go as a miner. He went as a carpenter on contract to the colliery, repairing the timber supports in the deep shafts the company had cut too quickly and too fast. On the morning of Wednesday, the 14th of February, 1891, which was St. Valentine's Day, a detail my grandmother never once mentioned to me, though she remembered every other detail of that morning until she died. Thomas kissed his wife at the kitchen door. My grandmother told me about that kiss once, when I was 15, though she never told me any of the rest. She said he kissed her first on the forehead and then on the mouth, and then he bent down and kissed the top of little Michael's head where the boy was sitting in his tall chair eating porridge. She said Thomas told her he would bring home a tin of candy from McAllister's for their Valentine's supper, and she laughed at him. Because Thomas Mullen had never once remembered a wedding anniversary, and here he was going to remember St. Valentine's Day. And then he put on his coat and his cap, and he walked down Linden Street in the blue half-dark of a February morning, and she never saw him alive in that town again. The siren at the Mullen colliery was a steam whistle that sat on the roof of the foreman's office, and it had 3 settings. 1 blast meant the end of a shift. 2 blasts meant a man had be. 3 blasts meant something worse than that, and the women of Scranton knew it without being told. And when the 3 blasts came across the valley on the morning of the 14th, my grandmother was standing at her kitchen table shelling peas into a blue enamel bowl, and she dropped the bowl on the floor without a thought. She did not bend to pick it up. She picked up Michael instead. She wrapped him in her woolen shawl, and she ran down Linden Street with her hair coming loose from its knot, and her apron flying, and her feet in house slippers. She ran the 3/4 of a mile to the colliery gate, and she was not the only woman running. Every woman in Scranton who had a husband or a son or a brother or a father in the number 7 shaft was running that morning. And by the time my grandmother reached the gate, 300 women were already pressing against the iron rails. The steam whistle was still blowing. Black smoke was pouring up out of the headframe like a column of ink. The company men had locked the gate. They would not let the women in. They stood on the inside of the iron rails with their arms folded and their faces set hard, and behind them, a little apart from the others, stood the shift foreman. He was a red-haired man in his early 40s named Sean Kelly, and he had his hat in his hands, and he would not look at any of the wives. My grandmother told me, many years later, that she remembered Sean Kelly that morning more clearly than she remembered any of the other men at the gate. She remembered the way he held his hat against his chest, as if it were something alive that he had just killed. She remembered that he did not look at Thomas's mother, who was standing at the front of the crowd, weeping. She remembered that he did not look at any of the women. She did not yet know why. There were 41 men in the number 7 shaft on the morning of the 14th. By 6 o'clock that evening, after the longest day of my grandmother's young life, the company had brought 18 of them up alive. Most of them had broken bones. 2 of them had been blinded by the dust. All of them had skin blacker than their own hair. They brought up 14 of the dead and laid them out on canvas stretchers in the colliery yard, and they let the wives and mothers come forward, one at a time, with a lantern, to see whether these 14 were the ones they had come to weep for. And then the company stopped bringing men up. They stopped because the last 20 feet of the number 7 shaft had come down on itself, and the main drift was buried under 200 tons of rock and coal and splintered timber. The mine engineer, a thin, quiet man with steel spectacles, came out of the foreman's office and stood in front of the women who had not yet found their husbands. And he said, in the flat and rehearsed voice of a man who had been told what to say, that there were 23 men still in the shaft. He said the company regretted to inform them that no further recovery was possible. He said the company would see to a proper service. And then he went back into the foreman's office, and he did not come out again that night. My grandmother did not weep that evening. She stood in the colliery yard with Michael in her arms, and she watched the faces of the other women who had not yet become widows, and she watched them understand, one by one. Some fainted, some screamed. Old Mrs. Doherty, who had lost her 2 sons and her husband in the same shift, walked home in silence without speaking a word to anyone, and 2 days later she was found dead in her bed, with her hands folded over a holy card of Saint Anne. My grandmother walked home carrying Michael. She did not cry until she reached the kitchen, and then she sat down on the kitchen floor with her child in her arms, and she cried for 9 hours without stopping. Uncle Michael could not remember this, because he was too small. But the neighbor on the left-hand side remembered it for the rest of her life, because she said she could hear it through the wall the whole night. Thomas Mullen's name was on the list of the 23. The company had his time card stamped at 6:32 that morning, and they had the log of the timber gang that had gone down at 6:45. And Thomas's name was at the bottom of the log in Sean Kelly's own handwriting. Because the bodies could not be recovered, the parish held a single mass for all 23 men on the following Sunday, which was the 22nd of February. 23 empty coffins were set in a long row before the altar of St. Peter's Cathedral, and Father O'Malley, who had been the parish priest in Scranton for 31 years, read each name aloud 3 times, and the families rose to their feet as each name was called. When my grandmother rose for Thomas Mullen, she held Michael against her shoulder, and Michael turned his face into her neck and did not cry, though nearly every other soul in the church was weeping openly. After the Mass, the 23 empty coffins were carried in a single slow procession to the new section of the cathedral churchyard, where a long trench had been cut in the iron-hard February ground. The coffins were placed in the trench side by side and covered with earth. At the head of the trench, the company paid for a single stone plaque, and on it the names of the 23 were carved in 2 columns. Thomas Mullen's name was the 9th from the top of the left-hand column. The stone is still there today. I have visited it many times. My grandmother used to take me to that stone every Valentine's Day when I was a little girl, and she would place a single tin of candy from McAllister's at the base of the stone, and then she would turn and walk home, and she would not say a single word about it to me for the whole walk. I understand now why she did that. 6 weeks after the funeral, on a rainy evening in late March, the postman came to the door of the small rented house on Linden Street with a single thick envelope in his hand. My grandmother had taken in 3 boarders by then, 2 sisters who worked at the millinery shop and a widowed schoolteacher. And she had moved her own bed out to the front parlor so she could rent the back bedroom for 50 cents a week. She was wearing her black mourning dress, the first of several she would wear over the next 3 years, and her hair was pulled back in the tight, practical knot she would wear for the next 70 years. She had Michael on one hip when she opened the door. The postman gave her the letter. He tipped his hat. He walked back down the path without speaking, because he had been delivering mail on Linden Street for many years, and he understood not to try to comfort a widow at 6 o'clock in the evening when she was trying to cook supper. My grandmother did not recognize the handwriting on the envelope. At least, she did not recognize it at first. But her hand began to shake all the same, because there was no return address written anywhere on the outside, and the postmark was from Harrisburg, which was 120 miles to the south, and she knew no one in Harrisburg. She had never had occasion to know anyone there. She put Michael down in his wooden playpen near the stove. She closed the door between the kitchen and the parlor so that the boarders would not overhear. She sat down in her husband's chair, which she had not moved since the day of the funeral, and she opened the envelope with her thumbnail. My grandmother dropped the letter on the floor. She sat for a long time with her hands over her face, and she could hear her own heart in her ears, louder than the kettle on the stove or the boarders talking quietly in the parlor. Then, very slowly, she bent down and she picked the letter up again. She read it straight through, beginning to end. And then she read it a second time. The letter ran 2 pages in Thomas Mullen's narrow, sloping hand. I have copied it out here exactly as she read it that evening, from a copy my grandmother made years later in her own handwriting and tucked into the biscuit tin. My dearest Clara, I know that you will have already buried me, and that you will have stood at the head of the trench at St. Peter's, and that Michael will not have cried, because Michael never cries in public, as you told me once. I know what you have suffered these last 6 weeks. I wish to God I could have spared you even 1 hour of it. I am alive. I am writing from a town whose name I will not put on this paper. I am not injured. I have food and a bed. But I cannot come home, Clara, and I cannot tell you yet why. I will tell you that the collapse on the 14th was not an accident. I will tell you that I saw who did it, and that he saw me see him. I will tell you that if I were to walk back into Scranton tomorrow, I would not live out the week. And I will tell you that there are reasons beyond my own skin why I must stay where I am for now. Burn this letter when you have finished reading it. Burn it in the kitchen stove. Do not show it to the priest. Do not show it to my mother. Do not show it to anyone from the colliery who comes to the house asking questions. If a man in a gray suit comes to your door and asks whether you have heard from me, you are to tell him that I am buried, and you are to tell him nothing else. You are the only soul on this earth who knows I am alive. I am trusting you with my life. I am trusting you with our son's life. I will write again when I can. I cannot tell you where I am going. I cannot tell you when I will come home. But I will come home, Clara. I swear it on our son's head. I will come home. Your husband and no one else's, Thomas. My grandmother did not scream. She did not cry. She stood up very slowly. She walked over to the kitchen stove. She opened the iron door. She held the letter above the coals for a long moment, and she did not put it in right away. She read it one more time, and then she folded it carefully into thirds, and she laid it down on the coals, and she watched it curl and blacken and turn to white ash. She did exactly what she had been told to do, but she kept the envelope. The envelope, postmarked Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, on the 25th of March, 1891, was the first of 28 envelopes that she would keep hidden in the biscuit tin in the attic for the next 71 years. Clara Mullen was 26 years old, and she had a son not yet 2. And she had just been told, by a man she had already buried, that he was not dead, that he was in hiding, and that she would have to lie to her own mother-in-law and to her priest and to everyone she had ever known in the town of Scranton for an unknown length of time, or he would really die. She was not a woman of great formal education. She had left school at the age of 14 to work in a dry goods store. But she was the daughter of a man who had walked out of County Mayo with nothing but the coat on his back and a 6-year-old girl on his shoulder, and she had been raised to understand that silence is a kind of strength the world does not always teach its women. She chose silence. She kept the envelope. She said nothing to anyone. When Thomas's mother came to the kitchen the next morning with a pan of bread pudding and eyes still swollen from weeping, my grandmother sat with the old woman at the kitchen table, and she accepted her tears, and she cried with her. and she did not say a single word about the letter. When Father O'Malley came to the house on Thursday afternoon to pray for Thomas's soul, my grandmother knelt beside him at the little altar she had built in the parlor, and she recited the Hail Mary and the Our Father, and she prayed for God to look after her husband wherever he was, and she let the priest assume that she meant heaven. She never told a living soul, not her mother, not her sister, not her son. She kept the secret for 71 years. It nearly went into the grave with her in 1964. And if I had not gone up to the attic that September afternoon, it would have gone into the fire at the church rummage sale, along with the broken chairs and the Christmas cards. I have thought often since that week about how close the truth came to disappearing. I think that is why she left the little note on the top of the biscuit tin. I think she did not want the truth to disappear. The second letter came in June of 1891, 3 months after the first. It was postmarked Pittsburgh. It was short. Dearest Clara, I am well. The boy is safe in your arms. That is enough for now. Burn this. Thomas. My grandmother burned the letter. She kept the envelope. She placed it carefully under the first envelope in the biscuit tin, which by then she had already hidden deep inside the cedar chest in the attic. And then she went downstairs and she made supper for the 3 boarders, and she bathed Michael in the tin tub beside the stove, and she put him to bed in her own bed, because he would not sleep anywhere else in those first months. And then she sat up by herself at the kitchen table, and she cried for a long time, very quietly, because the boarders were sleeping on the other side of the wall. Over the next 20 months, 25 more letters arrived. I have all of them now, and I have laid them out on a map of the United States that I unfolded across the dining room table in the stone house on Linden Street. The letters trace a long, looping path that my grandmother must have understood, even when she did not understand the reason behind it. From Pittsburgh in June of 1891, Thomas went west to Wheeling in August. From Wheeling, he traveled down the Ohio River to Cincinnati in October. From Cincinnati, he reached Louisville in December, and from Louisville to Nashville in February of 1892, and from Nashville to Memphis by March. After Memphis, he turned north again, St. Louis in May, Springfield in July, Chicago in September. And then the path turned west in earnest. Omaha in November, Denver in January of 1893, Salt Lake City in March, Reno in May, Sacramento in July, and then, slowly, back east again, all the way across the country, like a man tracking a shadow. Carson City in August, Cheyenne in September, back to Denver in October. And finally, in December of 1893, the last letter of all. Every letter said nearly the same thing. He was well. He was safe. The boy was safe in her arms, and that was enough for now. He would explain everything when he could. He asked her once, in the letter from Louisville, whether Michael had begun to talk. He asked her, in the letter from Omaha, whether her sister's cough had improved. In the letter from Reno, he wrote half a page about a church bell he had heard that had reminded him of the bell at St. Peter's. In the letter from Sacramento, he wrote that he had seen the Pacific Ocean for the first time in his life, and that he had thought of her. He never signed his full name. He never used an envelope with a return address on it, except for that very last letter. And he never, in any of the 27 letters between March of 1891 and December of 1893, told my grandmother what he was actually doing out there. In the autumn of 1892, a man in a gray suit came to the door of the small rented house on Linden Street. My grandmother was feeding Michael at the kitchen table when the knock came. She went to the door. The man on the porch was tall, clean-shaven, with a silver watch chain across his vest and a bowler hat held against his chest. He said he was from the Pennsylvania Coal and Timber Company, and that he had come out of an abundance of concern for her welfare to ask her a few questions about her late husband. My grandmother invited him in. She sat him down in Thomas's chair, the same chair she had read the first letter in, a year and a half before. She poured him a cup of coffee from the enamel pot on the stove, and she told him exactly what she told everyone else. She told him her husband had died in the collapse of the number 7 shaft in February of 1891. She told him his body had never been recovered. She told him he was buried with the 22 other men beneath the stone plaque at St. Peter's. She told him she prayed for his soul every night. She said all of this in the flat, tired voice of a widow who had said it 1,000 times. She let her eyes fill. She let Michael climb into her lap and put his head against her shoulder. She made the man in the gray suit uncomfortable, and she knew she was making him uncomfortable, and she did it on purpose. The man asked her 3 questions. He asked her whether she had received any letters from anywhere unusual in the past 2 years. He asked her whether any strangers had called at the house or sent messages through an intermediary. And he asked her whether her husband had ever spoken to her about a man named Sean Kelly. My grandmother said no to all 3 questions. She said it so plainly, so flatly, so tiredly, that the man in the gray suit believed her. He finished his coffee. He stood up. He tipped his hat. He said he was sorry to have disturbed her in her grief. He walked down Linden Street to a black carriage waiting at the corner, and the carriage drove away, and my grandmother closed the door and leaned her back against it and shook hard for a full 10 minutes. But she did not. On the 16th of December, 1893, a thick envelope came from Denver, Colorado, and this one had a return address written on the outside. The return address read, T. Mullen, care of the Larimer Street Boarding House, Denver, Colorado. My grandmother saw the return address before she saw anything else, and she sat down on the porch step with the envelope in her lap, and she did not move for a full hour. It was 16 degrees outside. She did not feel the cold. When she finally went inside and opened the letter, she found that it ran to 11 pages. It was the whole story at last. I will tell you what Thomas wrote, but I will give it to you in my own words, because Thomas's letter ran long, and because parts of what he wrote would make little sense to a reader who does not know what the Mullen Colliery and the town of Scranton looked like in 1891. What he wrote in 11 pages was this. On the morning of the 14th of February, Thomas had gone down into the number 7 shaft at 6:45 with the rest of the timber gang. They were there to repair a set of roof supports in the main drift, routine work, the same work they had done in a dozen other shafts over the previous year. By mid-morning, they had almost finished, and the shift foreman, Sean Kelly, had come down from the surface to inspect their work. There was a secondary shaft that branched off the main drift, about 60 feet behind where the timber gang was working. It was called the Old West Drift. It had been blocked by a rockfall a few weeks earlier, and the company had been debating whether to clear it out or to seal it off. Sean Kelly had made the decision, apparently, without consulting the mine engineer. At 10:15 in the morning, Kelly walked past the timber gang carrying a small canvas bag. He did not speak to the men. He went to the mouth of the Old West Drift. He was there for perhaps 2 minutes, and then he came back out. And he walked quickly back toward the surface, without looking at the timber gang at all. Thomas was the only man who saw Kelly go in and come out. The other members of the timber gang were at the far end of the main drift, hammering a brace. Thomas had straightened up from his work to wipe the sweat out of his eyes, and he had seen Kelly walk past, and he had thought it strange, and he had remembered it. 10 minutes after Sean Kelly walked back up toward the surface, the dynamite charge that he had set at the mouth of the Old West Drift went off. It had not been meant to cause a collapse. As Thomas later understood, after speaking to an old mining engineer he met in Pittsburgh, the charge had been meant to clear the rockfall in the Old West Drift. But Sean Kelly was not a mining engineer. He had set the charge wrong. The blast brought down not only the rockfall in the Old West Drift, but also the roof of the main drift, where the 23 men of the shift were working. 200 tons of rock came down in 3 seconds. Thomas had been standing at that exact moment at the junction of the two drifts. The junction was the strongest point of the roof because the timber gang had just reinforced it that very morning. He survived. He was thrown sideways against a wall of coal, and his left leg was broken, and his ear was torn half off, and his lungs were full of black dust. But he survived. The other 22 men in the main drift did not survive. They were killed instantly, or nearly so. Thomas could hear 2 of them moaning in the dark for some minutes. By the time he could move, they had stopped moaning. Thomas did not try to crawl out toward the main shaft because he knew the main shaft was buried under the collapse. He crawled in the other direction instead, back through the Old West Drift, past the ruined remnants of Kelly's charge, into the old workings of the mine. These had been abandoned 20 years before, and he had only seen them once, on a walking tour with the mine engineer during his first week on the job. He crawled for 6 hours through tunnels no taller than his own body, past rotten timbers and pools of standing water, guided only by the sense that the air was moving, that somewhere ahead of him there had to be an old ventilation slope that opened to the surface. There was. It was an old fan shaft, sealed at the top with a wooden cover, half a mile from the Mullen colliery headframe. Thomas pushed through the cover at around 5 in the afternoon of the 14th. He dragged himself out into a stand of hemlock trees on the ridge above the town. He lay on the frozen ground in the snow, and he laughed, and he cried, and he thanked God for the fan shaft. And then he thought of Sean Kelly. Thomas understood what had happened. He understood it with the clarity of a man who has just crawled through his own grave and come out the other side. Sean Kelly had set the charge. Sean Kelly had killed 22 men by negligence, or perhaps by design, because everyone in Scranton knew that 2 of those 22 were the Donnelly brothers, who were first cousins of the dead union organizer Michael Donnelly, who had been found shot in a back alley only the autumn before. The Donnelly brothers had been agitating for a safety committee. They had been troublemakers in the view of the company. Sean Kelly had been the man who had kept them on the hardest shifts. If Thomas walked back into Scranton that evening and told what he had seen to the county sheriff, he would be dead within the week. Kelly was a company man. The sheriff was a company man. The mayor was a company man. The only man in Lackawanna County who might have believed him was the editor of the labor paper, The Miner's Voice, and the editor of The Miner's Voice had been run out of town by the company's private guards just the month before. Thomas had been told once, in a Pittsburgh saloon, by an old union organizer with a ruined left hand, that if you ever saw something a company man had done that you were not meant to see, you did not go to the law. You ran. You kept running. You wrote to your wife in a borrowed hand from a town far from where you actually were. And you waited. You waited for the living witness against you to die. Of drink, of disease, of a bar fight, of whatever the rough life of such men would eventually give him. And when the witness was gone, you came home. The living witness against Thomas Mullen was Sean Kelly himself. So Thomas ran. He walked down the ridge in the dark. He reached the rail yard on the east end of town. He climbed into an empty coal car of a train that was leaving for Harrisburg, and he lay flat on the floor of the car with his broken leg stretched out in front of him. And he did not step off the train until it reached Harrisburg, 200 miles to the south. He bought a new coat. He bought a new cap. He bought a stolen railroad paper from a man in a saloon. And on the 25th of March, 1891, at a rented desk in a Harrisburg boarding house, he wrote my grandmother the first letter. For the next 20 months, Thomas tracked Sean Kelly across the United States. Kelly had left Scranton 3 days after the collapse, on company money, bound first for Pittsburgh and then for points unknown. From Pittsburgh, Kelly had moved west and south, and Thomas followed him, not closely, never closely enough to be seen, but through the Union network, which in those years had a man in every rail yard and every mining camp and every frontier saloon between Pennsylvania and California. An old railroad brakeman in Cincinnati told Thomas that Kelly had passed through his yard in September of 1891, bound for Louisville. A saloon keeper in Louisville told him Kelly had gone down the Ohio River to Memphis. A Union organizer in Memphis told him Kelly had bought a silver mine claim in Colorado. And so on, across the map of the nation, for 2 long years. Thomas was not trying to kill Sean Kelly. I want to be very clear about this, because I have asked myself many times over the years whether my grandfather was a murderer in all but the deed, and I have come slowly to the conclusion that he was not. Thomas Mullen was trying to outlive Sean Kelly. He was trying to stay close enough to Kelly's trail to know where he was, so that when Kelly eventually died, of drink or of fever, or of the ERO, rough end that such men always meet, Thomas could learn of it and come home. And in November of 1893, in Leadville, Colorado, Sean Kelly was shot dead in a saloon fight by a man named Jensen over an argument about a card game. The death was reported in the Leadville newspaper, the Herald-Democrat, and a Union man in Leadville cut out the clipping and mailed it to Thomas, who was by then in Denver. Thomas received the clipping on the 30th of November. He bought a train ticket to Scranton that same afternoon, and on the 16th of December, he sat down at the writing desk in the front parlor of the Larimer Street boarding house, and he wrote my grandmother the 11-page letter, and he ended it with one question: "Will you have me back?" My grandmother sat at the kitchen table of the rented house on Linden Street, and she read the 11 pages 3 times over. She took out a clean sheet of paper from the box she had once bought for writing to her sister. She dipped her pen. She wrote one word, centered near the top of the page: "Yes." She signed her name under it. She folded the paper in half. She sealed it in an envelope, and she addressed the envelope to the Larimer Street boarding house, Denver, Colorado. She walked to the post office in the snow, carrying Michael on her hip, and she posted it that afternoon. 3 days before Christmas, on the morning of the 19th of January, 1894, the westbound express from Chicago was due at the Scranton station at 10 minutes past 9. My grandmother had received a telegram the night before, the only telegram she had ever received in her life, and it had said only, "Arriving Thursday morning express, T." She had stayed up the whole night in Thomas's chair, holding the telegram against her heart and when morning came, she put on her black mourning dress, because she had not owned another dress for almost 3 years, and she dressed Michael in his Sunday suit. She walked to the station, carrying him in her arms. She did not speak to anyone on the walk. The station was crowded with the usual morning travelers. 2 drummers with their sample cases, a priest on his way to a parish in Wilkes Barre, a pair of elderly sisters in black traveling to a funeral in Easton. No one paid any attention to the young widow with the small boy. My grandmother stood at the far end of the platform, near the freight room, where the sunlight came in yellow through the high windows and fell in long bars across the wooden planks. The train came in. The steam blew out in a white cloud that rolled the length of the platform. The doors opened. Passengers stepped down. For a long moment, my grandmother did not see him. The steam was thick. The passengers were many. And then the steam cleared, and she saw a man in a long gray coat at the far end of the platform, standing alone with a single leather traveling bag at his feet. He had a beard. His dark hair had gone gray at the temples. He was much thinner than he had been. He saw her. He did not run to her. He did not call out to her. He picked up his bag, and he began to walk the length of the platform. Slowly, the way a man walks toward something he has been walking toward for almost 3 years. And when he was 3 feet away from her, he stopped. And he knelt down in the slush at her feet, very slowly, because of his leg. And he looked at Michael, who had his face buried in his mother's neck. "Michael," my grandmother said softly, "this is your father." Michael lifted his head from her neck. He was 3 years and a half old. He had never seen Thomas Mullen except in the framed photograph over my grandmother's bed. He looked at the man kneeling in the slush. He looked up at his mother. He looked back at the man. "My mother told me you went to heaven," he said. "She takes me every year on St. Valentine's Day, and we leave a tin of candy at your stone." Thomas began to cry. He cried without making any sound. He reached out one hand very slowly, so as not to frighten the boy, and Michael did not shrink back. Michael watched his father cry, and he did not seem afraid. And after a moment, he reached out his own small hand, and he placed it on his father's cheek gravely, the way small children do when they are trying to understand something that has not yet been explained to them. "You came back?" Michael said. "I came back," Thomas said. "I will not write out here everything that happened in the weeks and months that followed my grandfather's return. The newspapers of Scranton covered the story thoroughly enough, and the court records of the Lackawanna County Courthouse in Wilkes Barre tell the rest. There was an inquest. Sean Kelly's brother, who was dying of tuberculosis in a charity hospital in Philadelphia, gave a deathbed confession that corroborated every line of my grandfather's account. The Pennsylvania Coal and Timber Company was indicted, though nothing was ever proven against the men in gray suits who had sent their agent to my grandmother's door. The stone plaque at St. Peter's was removed and recarved with 22 names instead of 23. Thomas Mullen's name was taken off the stone. He and my grandmother went together on a cold afternoon in March of 1894 to watch it come down. Thomas never went back into a mine. He went back to carpentry. In 1897, after 3 more years of saving, he bought the stone house at 113 Linden Street. My grandmother lived in that house for the rest of her life. My mother was born in the upstairs bedroom in 1902. My Uncle Michael became a Catholic priest and pastored a parish in Buffalo for 40 years. No one in the family ever spoke, not once, of the 20 months between the collapse and the homecoming. My grandmother kept the biscuit tin. She kept it locked in the cedar chest in the attic. And she never, in 70 years, told another living soul. Thomas died in 1938, at the age of 75, in the upstairs bedroom of the stone house on Linden Street. My grandmother sat with him the last 3 nights. When he died, she closed his eyes with 2 fingers, and she went up to the attic, and she took out the biscuit tin, and she laid the small folded note on top of it that reads, "He came home. That is the only story that matters." And then she went downstairs, and she made supper for her grandchildren, and she did not say a word. It is the autumn of 1964 as I write this. I am sitting at my grandmother's kitchen table in the stone house on Linden Street, with the biscuit tin open in front of me, and the 28 envelopes arranged in a long line. My grandmother has been dead for 3 weeks. I have read the letters. I have traced the map. I have written down here the best understanding I have been able to make of what happened between the 14th of February, 1891, and the 19th of January, 1894, in the town of Scranton, Pennsylvania. And I have asked myself, over and over, why my grandmother kept the secret for 71 years, and why, at the very end of her life, she changed her mind and left the biscuit tin for someone in the family to find. I believe she did it for the 22. I believe she did not want the 22 to be forgotten. I believe she wanted someone, someday, to know that 22 men were killed on St. Valentine's Day in 1891 in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and that no company president was ever punished for it, and that the only man who lived to tell the truth had to live 20 months above ground in the daylight, writing letters under a false name from cities he could not put on the envelope, so that his son could grow up without a father in order to have a father at the end. She wanted the 22 to matter. And I think she wanted us to know that the only reason my grandfather came home was because she did not give up on him. She did not tell. She did not weep in public. She did not let the man in the gray suit see her hands shake. She chose silence, and she held it, alone, for 20 months. And she held the tin for 70 years after that. And she never broke once, until she chose to, at the very end. I will publish this account next year in the Pittsburgh newspaper where I work, in the Sunday edition. Some of the grandchildren of the men in the main drift still live in Scranton, and I hope they will read it. I hope they will know. And I hope that, somewhere, a young widow reading this in the back pages of her Sunday paper will understand that faith is not always the loud kind. Sometimes faith is a biscuit tin in an attic on Linden Street, and a woman who would not believe her husband was dead, even when 23 names were carved in stone. Some loves are buried. Some rise from the shaft.